Hi, I'm Graham England and I live in Denver, Colorado. As you can probably tell from the accent, I wasn't born here, and as my last name suggests, I'm actually from England, moved here in '99. Now, I've been working with test automation for 28 years now, but for the last 16 years of that, I've been focusing on using UFT for all of our GUI testing. In this video, I'm going to explain why I chose UFT in the first place and how come we're still using it after all this time. I'm also going to give an overview of our automation framework around that, which we call Test Factory, and how it helps us. And lastly, because our company is moving into safe methodology, agile, and a CI/CD environment, that we're now really focusing on LeanFT. So I want to show you what I've done with LeanFT, dig into some of the code, and tell you about some of the issues I faced along the way.
So let's walk through some slides quickly together. I call this presentation 1.5 million validations per month with an automated testing framework, and you'll find out why shortly. First of all, let's look at some company information. I work for Travelport, which is a global technology company building travel industry solutions. I work in the Denver Test Automation Group, which is part of the QM Shared Services Center of Excellence. I actually started out my career as a developer for the first 9 years, back when I had hair, as you can see from this picture. I shifted into QA because of the huge UK recession of 91-92, but I actually grew to love the challenge of automated testing as it continually evolves, and so I've been doing it ever since. I joined Travelport in '96. We changed test tool a couple of times, and both times it meant I had to rewrite my common function library. So when we switched again to UFT, or QTP as it was in 2003, I rewrote the function library in VB.NET for better portability. The .NET library became core of a powerful automation framework that we call Test Factory to support 24/7 testing in our global organization. In 2017, I created a Java version of this function library, allowing us to support more platforms and the company's adoption of SAFe. The biggest problem that we had was that we had a lot of applications at a very diverse range of solutions. The challenge, of course, being, can we find one test tool that can support all these different technologies? And the answer, of course, is yes, UFT. Not only does it solve our need for testing such diverse technologies, but it also allowed us to bring in test automation contractors. This led to a need for coding standards, version control, centralized test data, a lab of 300 virtual machines, and a simple scheduling and reporting mechanism. The end result was a solid automation framework which continues to support all of our testing needs today. This framework allowed us to incorporate LeanFT for our emerging CI/CD requirements, but we'll see more about that later. So, at a very high level, here's the way that our Test Factory framework is used to execute and report tests. Tests get kicked off from our Test Factory scheduling website, or a Jenkins or Azure DevOps pipeline, by using our common library to update our scheduling database. The virtual machines in our test lab are constantly looking at the scheduling database to see if there's a test that they can run. When a virtual machine gets the message to run a test, it pulls the script from ALM along with test data and necessary library files from a common storage area. Incidentally, the scripts and code libraries are all written to our documented coding standard and checked with a homegrown parsing tool. Also, the scripts are version controlled natively in ALM, while the code libraries and test data are version controlled through either SVN or occasionally Git. As the test executes, it writes the results out to our shared storage so that the results can be viewed through our website as the test runs remotely. Once the test has finished executing, the test machine writes the final result information to ALM and the scheduling database. This information is then fed back to the scheduling website, Jenkins and Azure DevOps, and if necessary, emailed to those involved in the project. So why UFT for 16 years? You can read through the bullet points here, but the highlights are really that it supports this diverse range of technologies. It's also got multi-browser support out of the box. It natively interacts with AUT's objects, that's your application under test, their properties and methods, and that gives you robust and reliable testing. You can record an initial script, which can then be enhanced for maintainability and value. There's an object repository which supports easy management of object mapping while making script more readable, and there's 24/7 support, which even extends to helping you integrate with tools such as JUnit and NUnit, Cucumber and Jenkins. I said I'd come to this eventually, so when I looked at how many tests we've run in the past month, this is what I came up with. We have 74 automation projects running tests, and that equates to over 1.5 million test cases or validations, pass-fail. Now, while UFT has served us very well, because Travelport adopted the SAFE methodology for software development, we had new challenges. First of all, developers don't have VB experience. VB is now unfortunately a dead language. A couple of months ago, even IE stopped supporting it by default. Personally, I love it, but I understand where the industry's going. Developers also don't want to install and learn a whole new application if they can help it. They really want to continue using their preferred environment, say C# in Visual Studio, or Java in Eclipse or IntelliJ. We also need tighter integration with CI/CD, BDD, TDD-oriented tools, including SpecFlow, Cucumber, MS Teams, Jenkins, NUnit and JUnit. And lastly, we also need support for non-Windows environments. So for this reason, we have now integrated the use of LeanFT to our framework, which addresses all of these concerns and does it well. As you'll see from this slide, while UFT is perfect for a test automation engineer, LeanFT is aimed at a true dev tester with strong programming skills. Because LeanFT integrates with the tools developers already work with, it enables them to easily step into the world of automated GUI testing. At the same time, LeanFT is a good way for experienced test automation engineers to start moving in a dev tester role. This approach will help Travelport's development and test teams to work closer with one another, which is exactly what the SAFE methodology requires. Now let me show you what this looks like in our .NET environment. I'm going to give you a lot of information now, but do bear in mind that you can come back to this video and pause it and look at the code and digest it at your own leisure. So here we see Visual Studio, and I'm coding our tests in C# along with LeanFT, NUnit and SpecFlow, which is Cucumber for .NET. I've also integrated our test factory framework by calling our .NET common library. While I could run everything locally from here, I also have the option to add the test code into the same repository as the application and update the build process in my VSTS, or as it's called now, Azure DevOps, pipeline to run the tests automatically before deployment. I also have the option to run the tests on remote agent machines. When you create a new LeanFT project in Visual Studio, it creates template files for you to build out with code. So let's take a quick look at these files now. I'm going to start with our hooks file. That's used for event bindings such as before feature and before scenario. I'm calling our framework functions to create expandable feature sections in my HTML results log and the scenario title at the start of each new scenario. At the bottom of this screen, we can see a function to log into the application under test if we're not already signed in. Now with this, I can add a given website is logged in clause in any of our feature files. This is a typical example of what to place in this hooks file. Moving on to the unit test class base file. This is where we specify our test setup and teardown routines. I placed our application logger credentials here and also calls to connect the test with our automation framework. You'll also see at the bottom where we initialize the LeanFT format of test results log. This now is the helper file, used as a common library of project-specific functions. For example, in here I have functions to make it easy to update our test results, as well as to interact with key windows in the application under test. This might look a lot more familiar to you. Here is an example Gherkin format feature file for scenario test steps and validations. You can see the familiar scenario and given them when statements, similar to using Cucumber in the Java world. Consider this to be the test data which drives your tests. It can easily be understood by anyone involved in the project. SpecFlow makes this task really simple and reduces the possibility of introducing syntax errors. ALM Octane also does a lot to help with this too. This here is the step definitions file, containing the code behind the feature file that we just looked at. Typically I create one feature and step definition pair for each test scenario. If I find that I need a step definition function in multiple feature files, I'll move the function to the hooks file instead. On a larger project, I might create several hooks files, grouped and named to make it easy to find what we're looking for. This is where I found that there's a definite lack of standards. You pretty much make it up as you go along and do whatever makes best sense to you. Moving on to LeanFT's Object Identification Center window. This is integrated into Visual Studio once you install LeanFT. It's similar to UFT's Object Spy. You use it to identify the objects in your application under test that you're going to use in your actual test. Once you've done that, you can directly add objects from the Object Identification Center into an application model, and that's similar to UFT's Object Repository. Now, while you don't have to use an application model, it keeps your test code much neater and easier to read. Also, it's then easier to update your test to match changes in your application's GUI without needing to change your actual code. Here's an example of how the application model makes your code easier to read. The Object Identification Center has the ability to record code as you interact with your application under test, similar to the way that UFT does. Highlighted here is what the code looks like without the use of the application model, and then below it is the single line equivalent when you do use it. Much nicer. We did consider using Selenium and Appium for our testing as an alternative to LeanFT. However, without LeanFT's Object Identification Center and application model functionality, which integrates nicely into your IDE, there'd be a lot more work involved in both test creation and maintenance. Not only that, but you would need a deeper understanding of the UI components at the code level, meaning that a senior developer might need to build the scripts. With LeanFT, developers of all levels can write scripts, which takes a lot less time to write, and anyone on the team can make changes to them, because basically they're consistent and easy to understand. Now, if you're working in Java instead of .NET, all the principles are exactly the same, except you'd use Eclipse or IntelliJ instead of Visual Studio, you'd use Java instead of C#, you'd use JUnit instead of NUnit, you use Cucumber instead of SpecFlow, and you might use Jenkins or ALM Octane even instead of VSTS. Now, I mentioned earlier that there were some challenges along the way, so here are some of the gotchas. I found that there's very limited or no support for third-party and open source tools. I found it rather confusing for all the different components involved for how to download them and configure them to work with one another. There was certainly a lot to learn and a lack of industry standards. There was some confusion over which version of Visual Studio to use. It can be very expensive. I mean, for example, most developers are using the Enterprise Edition, and that gives them access to an MSDN license. But for all your dev testers, maybe it's better to go for Visual Studio Professional, which is just a one-off small cost for the software itself. The next confusion was to where to write the code in all the template files that are created for you, and that's why I walked through it earlier for any of you that might be starting out. Also, in Visual Studio or Eclipse, if you create a new LeanFT project, the question was which template to use. There's a lot of new terminology, so hopefully you know what you're doing when you get started, but otherwise it's a case of trial and error. There are some very good help files available though. The next question I had was uploading LeanFT jars to our Nexus Maven repository. Actually turned out to be fairly simple, but because I had limited exposure in the past to Maven and Nexus, this was something new to me. Thankfully, again, there was some good README files that was supplied by Micro Focus. And then lastly, how to publish the results to VSTS or Jenkins. All worth it though. Here are some of the positive management comments I received on the LeanFT-based testing approach. Here at Travelport, as more projects move to the SAFe methodology, the LeanFT approach is certainly gaining interest. Developers and testers shift left and work more closely together, making this approach much more feasible than how we could do it with UFT. Developers bring the code, tools and environment knowledge to the table, while the testers provide solid testing practices and application subject matter expertise. Working together transfers knowledge in both directions, helping to unify the agile teams and provide better quality applications in less time.
So there you go. I hope this is encouraging to you that you might want to get started with LeanFT, and hopefully this video will help you through some of the early steps. On the other hand, maybe you're already using LeanFT, and if you are, and maybe you're doing things differently, maybe your code is in different places, maybe you're writing the code slightly differently, I would love it if you want to reach out to me and we can maybe swap experiences and learn from one another. Thank you for watching this video. Have a great day.